This gospel was silenced for 2,000 years because it revealed a love that history never accepted, a love so powerful that it threatened the very foundations of established religious power. Today, for the first time in centuries, that silence is broken, and the truth emerges from the deepest shadows of human history. Did you know there's a lost gospel that would radically change everything you thought you knew about Christianity? An ancient text that miraculously survived the systematic burning of censorship, hidden in the sands of the Egyptian desert for exactly 1,600 years. A gospel that not only reveals who Mary Magdalene really was, but completely shatters the official narrative we've been told about her for centuries of deliberate historical manipulation. For millennia, we've been told she was a repentant prostitute, a sinner who found redemption at the feet of Jesus. But that story, that image seared into our minds with a hot iron, is a deliberate and calculated lie. A historical falsification so profound and systematic that even the Catholic Church itself had to officially admit in 1969 that it had been completely wrong for 2,000 years, but the damage had already been done. The truth had already been buried under endless layers of propaganda and institutional misinformation. Who was Mary Magdalene really? Why did early Christians reverently call her the Apostle of the Apostles? Why was Peter deeply and openly jealous of her, according to the most reliable ancient texts? Why do the Gnostic Gospels consistently present her as the most enlightened disciple and closest to the Master? And why does her personal gospel, found in 1896 in the ruins of Egypt, remain one of the best-kept secrets of modern Christianity? In this forbidden and censored gospel, Mary is not a passive follower waiting for crumbs of wisdom. She is Jesus's closest and most intimate disciple, the only one who truly understood his deepest and most mystical teachings, the only person to whom Jesus revealed spiritual secrets that he didn't even share with the 12 most renowned apostles. And this, precisely this, was what they could never allow the world to know. Imagine for a moment that absolutely everything you were taught about early Christianity was filtered through a millennia-old political agenda, that the most transformative and liberating truths had been deliberately hidden because they dangerously challenged the established order, that there existed a spiritual dimension to Christ's authentic message so radical, so absolutely liberating, that they preferred to completely erase it from history rather than allow it to flourish in humanity. This isn't just another video about cheap religious conspiracies or baseless theories. We're not going to speculate irresponsibly or invent fanciful theories without a solid basis. We're going to meticulously examine real texts, fully verifiable archaeological discoveries, and historical evidence that has been patiently waiting in university libraries and prestigious museums for over a full century. Evidence that serious and respected scholars have meticulously analyzed for decades, but that rarely reaches the general public. Have you ever wondered why so many Gospels exist that are called lost or apocryphal? Why did only 4 specific texts survive the political canonization process, when we know historically that dozens of detailed accounts existed about Jesus and his revolutionary teachings? Who exactly decided which specific truths deserved to be preserved and which ones should disappear forever from humanity's collective memory? The answer will profoundly impact you and change your perspective forever. Because it's not just about Mary Magdalene and her extraordinary personal story, it's about a completely different way of understanding authentic Christian spirituality. A revolutionary perspective that places divine power directly in your hands, without manipulative intermediaries, without oppressive hierarchies, without institutions that artificially control your personal and intimate access to the sacred. In the next few minutes, you'll discover why this specific gospel was so extraordinarily dangerous that they chose to consign it to eternal oblivion. You'll learn the exact words Mary Magdalene wrote about her private and intimate conversations with Jesus. You'll understand why his revolutionary message about the inner Christ was considered a deadly heresy by those who systematically built a religious empire based on absolute external control. And in the end, when the full truth is out in the open, you will have to personally decide what to do with this explosive information. Because once you know this story, once you contemplate the magnitude of what was suppressed, you can no longer feign ignorance. Prepare for a transformative journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the true origins of Christianity. a journey toward a truth that survived 2 millennia of relentless censorship to reach you. You felt it too, didn't you? That deep unease that stirs in your chest when you hear the official versions about Mary Magdalene, that visceral feeling that something fundamental doesn't add up, that you've been told only a fraction of the truth. You're not crazy. You're not being a rebel without a cause. Your intuition is completely correct. For years, maybe decades, you've carried questions that no one in your church seemed willing to answer honestly. Questions that made you feel guilty for even thinking them. Why are women so underrepresented in the Gospels if Jesus clearly valued them? Why does Mary Magdalene appear at such pivotal moments but then disappear from the narrative? Why do I feel like something important about the origins of my faith is being hidden from me? These questions are not heresy. They are signs of a heart searching for authentic truth. They are evidence of a soul that refuses to settle for superficial answers when it knows there is something deeper waiting to be discovered. Check out these real comments I've received on past videos and tell me if they don't resonate deeply with your own experience. Ever since I was a little girl, I felt like something didn't add up with the story of Mary Magdalene. My grandmother told me that holy women can be powerful too, but at church, I only heard about their sin. Another writes, "Pastor, I've been in ministry for 30 years and these questions burn inside me. How can I preach with authority if I feel like I don't know the whole story?" And this comment broke my heart. My daughter asked me why Jesus didn't choose women as apostles if he loved them so much. I didn't know how to answer, because I have that doubt myself. I feel like a spiritual fraud. Do you recognize that anguish? Have you experienced that heartbreaking tension between the faith you love and the doubts you can't silence? You're not alone. Millions of sincere Christians have walked through this valley of shadows, feeling spiritually orphaned because traditional answers no longer satisfy their deep hunger for authentic truth. Perhaps you grew up in a deeply religious family where questioning any aspect of doctrine was considered a lack of faith. Perhaps you were taught that doubting was sinful, that difficult questions were attacks from the enemy on your soul. But here's the beautiful and painful paradox. It is precisely your genuine love for Christ that compels you to look beyond simplistic explanations. I know your story because it's my story too. I know those sleepless nights where you pray for clarity, where you beg God to remove your doubts if they're misguided, or to give you wisdom to understand if there are deeper truths to explore. I know that heartbreaking feeling of being torn between loyalty to your tradition and integrity in your personal search for truth. I've seen pastors weep in private because they feel they are repeating memorized answers to questions that deserve serious investigation. I've met brilliant theologians who quietly confess their own doubts about official versions they learned to publicly defend. I've hugged mothers struggling to transmit an authentic faith to their children when they themselves are questioning fundamental elements of what they were taught. And here's what you need to hear. These doubts don't disqualify you as a Christian. They don't make you a heretic. They don't mean your faith is weak. On the contrary, they demonstrate that your relationship with God is mature enough to seek truth over comfort, authentic understanding over blind conformity. Because when Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free," he wasn't talking about settling for the first answers you're given. He was talking about a deep, sometimes uncomfortable, but always transformative search for the authentic reality of his message. The truth about Mary Magdalene that you are about to discover won't destroy your faith. It will liberate it. It won't alienate Christ from you. It will bring you closer to a richer and fuller understanding of who he really was and how his original message was even more radical and transformative than what you'd been taught. Because it turns out your intuition was right. Crucial information has indeed been withheld from you. There is indeed a dimension of Christian history that has been deliberately suppressed. And yes, recovering that truth can heal spiritual wounds you didn't even know you had. Many have written to me saying, "After learning the true story of Mary Magdalene, for the first time in years I can pray without feeling that inner tension. For the first time, the pieces fit together. For the first time, I feel like my faith and my intellect can coexist peacefully." Others have shared powerful testimonies. "Now I understand why I was so drawn to Mary Magdalene as a child, even though I was taught to see her only as an example of redeemed sin. My soul knew there was something more, something powerful and beautiful that I wasn't being told." A woman wrote to me, "I am 60 years old and have been in women's ministry for 40, I always felt that something was missing in our understanding of the role of women in early Christianity. After learning the truth about Mary Magdalene, I can finally teach with authority and without internal contradictions. This revelation you are about to receive is not just historical information. It is medicine for the soul that has been sickened by half-truths. It is fresh water for the spirit that has been thirsting for authenticity. It is the missing puzzle piece that will finally allow your image of Christ and his message to be completed in all its original glory. But before we continue, I want you to know something important. What you're about to hear isn't New Age speculation or cheap conspiracy theory. We're not going to romanticize Mary Magdalene into something she wasn't. We're going to examine real historical evidence, authentic ancient texts and testimonies that have been available in scholarly circles for over a century, but rarely reach the pews for reasons you'll soon fully understand. The manuscripts we will study were discovered by serious archaeologists, translated by world-renowned linguists, and analyzed by internationally respected historians. We are not inventing anything. We are recovering what was always there, hoping someone would have the courage to tell it. If you feel this truth deserves to be told, if you recognize in your heart that it's time for half-truths to give way to the full story, subscribe now so that it will never be silenced again. Because what you're about to discover in the next few minutes won't just change your perspective on Mary Magdalene, it will completely transform your understanding of what it means to be an authentic follower of Christ in a world that has distorted his message for 2 millennia. Your search for truth is no accident. It's no coincidence that you're here at this precise moment in human history. It's time for the questions you've silently carried to finally find answers that honor both your faith and your intelligence, both your devotion and your unquenchable thirst for authentic and transformative truth. Why was her story erased? This question has tormented historians for more than a century, ever since the first fragments of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene were discovered in 1896 at an antiques market in Cairo. But the answer isn't what you might expect. It wasn't simply misogyny. It wasn't just patriarchal politics. It was something much deeper and more threatening. Mary Magdalene represented a form of Christianity that placed spiritual power directly in the hands of the individual, without the need for institutional intermediaries. Imagine for a moment that in the early years of Christianity, there were multiple currents, multiple interpretations of Christ's message. Some emphasized hierarchical authority, others promoted direct mystical experience. Some viewed salvation as an institutional process, others presented it as an immediate inner awakening. Mary Magdalene had become the living symbol of this second current, which challenged everything the religious elites were constructing. The Gospel of Mary is not just a text about an extraordinary woman. It is a revolutionary manifesto on the nature of spiritual authority. Within its pages, we find intimate conversations between Mary and Jesus about mystical visions, about the soul transcending material limitations, about direct knowledge of the divine that requires no external validation. For those who were establishing a church based on hierarchical control, this message was pure dynamite. Consider this fragment of the original text. The Savior said to her, "Blessed are you because you did not falter at seeing me, for where the mind is, there is treasure." These simple words contain a theological bombshell. Jesus is validating Mary's visionary experience, confirming that she can directly access spiritual truth without mediators. He is saying that divine treasure is found where the mind is prepared, not necessarily where the authorized institution is. But here comes the part that truly terrified the early church leaders. Not only did Mary have access to these private teachings, but Jesus instructed her to share them with others. The Gospel recounts how after the Ascension, the apostles were confused and fearful. Mary stands and comforts them, saying, "Do not weep or grieve or doubt, for His grace will be with you and protect you." Can you imagine the tension in that room? The men who had walked with Jesus for years, who had been officially designated as His apostles, being comforted and taught by a woman who claimed to have access to revelations they hadn't received. Peter himself explodes in the text, asking, "Did He speak privately to a woman and not plainly to us? Should we all turn and listen to her? Did He prefer her to us?" Peter's question reveals the core of the conflict. It wasn't just about gender. It was about authority. It was about who had the right to interpret and transmit Christ's deepest teachings. Mary represented a model of spiritual leadership based on direct mystical experience, while Peter defended a model based on official appointment and hierarchical structure. The text continues with Levi defending Mary. "Peter, you were always impulsive. Now I see you contending against the woman as if she were an adversary. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. He loved her more than us." These 5 words contain the mystery that has fascinated and disturbed Christians for 2 millennia. What kind of love was this? Why did Mary have access to teachings that others didn't? And why did this love and this special access become such a threat that they preferred to bury the whole story? The answer takes us to the heart of 2 completely different visions of Christianity. One vision, the one that ultimately prevailed, presents the Church as the only valid path to God, with priests and bishops as necessary intermediaries between the human and the divine. The other vision, preserved in the Gospel of Mary, suggests that every soul can directly access the divine presence through contemplation, inner vision, and mystical union. Mary Magdalene was not just another follower. She was the custodian of an esoteric tradition, a line of teaching that dated back to the most ancient mystery schools, but had been transformed by the revolutionary message of Christ. It brought together the Gnostic wisdom of Alexandria, Jewish mystical traditions, and the new Christian revelation. The Gospel describes how Jesus taught him about the 7 powers of anger that the soul must overcome in its ascension toward the divine. He spoke to him about the illusory nature of the material world and how the awakened soul can transcend these limitations. These teachings reflect a philosophical and spiritual sophistication that rivaled the finest schools of thought of the time. But there was something even more disturbing. Mary not only received these teachings, she understood them better than the others. The text mentions that when she began to recount a vision she had had, Andrew protested, "I don't believe the Savior said this, for certainly these teachings are strange ideas." Mary had accessed levels of understanding that even the closest apostles found incomprehensible. Imagine the dilemma of the early church organizers. They had a woman who claimed to have direct spiritual authority, who possessed secret teachings from Jesus, and who was recognized by some as superior in understanding to the official apostles. If they allowed this narrative to flourish, the entire authority structure they were building would collapse. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity: transform Mary from a teacher into a penitent. Instead of the apostle to the apostles, she became a repentant prostitute. Instead of a bearer of mystical wisdom, she became an example of forgiven sin. Instead of Peter's rival for spiritual authority, she became a humble follower who had found grace. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that took centuries, but it was systematic and deliberate. Whenever texts appeared that featured Mary in leadership roles, they were declared heretical. Whenever Christian communities venerated her as a teacher, they were suppressed. Every time her gospel circulated, it was confiscated and destroyed. What makes this cover-up even more shocking is that it wasn't entirely successful. Despite centuries of persecution, the texts survived. Despite official propaganda, oral traditions persisted. Despite efforts to erase her from history, Mary Magdalene continued to appear in mystical tales, in esoteric traditions, and in the collective memory of communities that knew there was more to her story. And now, after 2,000 years, we can finally piece together that story. We can see what was hidden and understand why it was so dangerous that they chose to bury it. We can understand the political, religious, and social forces that conspired to silence one of the most powerful voices of early Christianity and keep hidden an entire dimension of Christ's message that could have changed the course of Western spiritual history forever. The council that made it disappear was not just a religious gathering. It was a political act of epic proportions that forever changed the face of Christianity. We're talking about the year 325 AD, when Emperor Constantine summoned more than 300 bishops to the city of Nicaea. Officially, the purpose was to unify Christian doctrine. In reality, it was the moment when imperial power decided which version of Christianity would survive and which would be buried forever. But the history of censorship against Mary Magdalene began long before. As early as the 2nd century, leaders like Irenaeus of Lyons were writing treatises against Gnostic texts, denouncing them as dangerous heresies that led the faithful astray from the true path. Why such fear? because these texts presented a radical Christianity that threatened the emerging model of the hierarchical church. Imagine the situation. In the early centuries of Christianity, multiple traditions coexisted. The Gnostics, who preserved the teachings of Mary Magdalene, taught that salvation came through direct knowledge of the divine. Emerging Orthodox Christians insisted that salvation was only possible through the institutional church. It was inevitable that these two visions would come into conflict. Princeton University historian Elaine Pagels has meticulously documented how the Nag Hammadi texts, discovered in 1945, reveal an epic battle for the soul of early Christianity. In her research, Pagels demonstrates that it was no coincidence that the Gnostic Gospels, including that of Mary Magdalene, were systematically excluded from the biblical canon. They represented an existential threat to the model of authority that church leaders were constructing. Consider this chilling fact. Of the more than 40 Gospels circulating in the early centuries of Christianity, only 4 were included in the New Testament. The selection criteria were not purely theological. They were also political. The texts that survived were those that supported a centralized church model with clear clerical authority and a defined hierarchical structure. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene was particularly problematic because it not only presented a woman in a position of spiritual leadership, but also questioned the very authority of the official apostles. In the text, when Mary shares her visions, Peter responds with hostility. Did the Savior speak privately to a woman and not clearly to us? Should we all turn and listen to her? This tension between Peter and Mary was not merely narrative. It represented two completely different models of Christian authority. Peter symbolized transmitted apostolic authority, the idea that spiritual leadership was based on official appointment and hierarchical succession. Mary represented charismatic authority, the idea that spiritual leadership was based on direct mystical experience and deep understanding. Professor Marvin Meyer of Chapman University has identified that the early church fathers were specifically concerned with what they called the heresy of women teaching. This wasn't just cultural misogyny, it was the recognition that if women could directly access divine authority, the entire structure of male mediation became unnecessary. Tertullian, writing in the 3rd century, was particularly vehement. A woman is not permitted to speak in church, nor to teach, nor to baptize, nor to offer, nor to claim for herself any function proper to man, much less the priestly office. These words were not accidental. They were a direct response to the popularity of figures like Mary Magdalene in early Christian communities. But the censorship campaign intensified dramatically during the reign of Theodosius I in the 4th century. In 380, Nicene Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. This meant that any form of Christianity that did not conform to the conciliar decrees was automatically considered heretical and subject to imperial persecution. The consequences were devastating. Gnostic texts were confiscated and burned in public bonfires. Communities that venerated Mary Magdalene as a teacher were forcibly dispersed. Teachers who taught her doctrines were exiled or executed. Libraries containing her Gospels were systematically looted. Historian Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina has estimated that more than 95% of early Christian literature was deliberately destroyed during these centuries of persecution. We're not talking about accidental loss over time. We're talking about a systematic program of cultural eradication. But there was heroic resistance. Entire communities risked their lives to preserve these sacred texts. In Egypt, Gnostic Christian monks buried entire libraries in clay jars, hiding them in remote desert caves. These brave guardians of tradition knew they were preserving something sacred for future generations who would seek the truth. The discovery of Nag Hammadi in 1945 was a direct result of that heroic resistance. An Egyptian peasant named Mohammed Ali al-Saman discovered a jar filled with codices that had been buried for over 1,600 years. Among these priceless treasures was a nearly complete copy of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. But even in modern times, institutional resistance to these texts has continued relentlessly. When the first fragments of the Gospel of Mary were acquired by Dr. Karl Reinhardt in 1896, the Catholic Church desperately attempted to purchase the manuscripts to prevent their publication. When that failed, they launched a systematic campaign of academic discredit. The Vatican issued official statements calling the Gospel a late Gnostic fiction of no historical value. Prominent Catholic scholars wrote academic articles questioning the text's authenticity. University lectures on the subject were cancelled under direct institutional pressure. This modern resistance reveals that fear of Mary Magdalene's revolutionary message is not just ancient history. It remains a contemporary threat to power structures that depend on the absolute control of spiritual authority. Professor James Robinson, senior editor of the Nag Hammadi Library, has extensively documented how even in secular academic circles there is profound resistance to taking these texts seriously. There is a profound reluctance, writes Robinson, to acknowledge that the Christianity we know is only a version that survived a political battle, not necessarily the most authentic or the closest to the original teachings of Jesus. Modern archaeological evidence fully supports this revolutionary perspective. Extensive excavations in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, have uncovered hundreds of papyrus fragments demonstrating that the Gnostic Gospels circulated widely in early Christian communities. In some regions, they were more popular than the Gospels that eventually entered the official canon. Karen King, professor of church history at Harvard, has convincingly argued that Mary Magdalene's exclusion from Christian leadership was not inevitable. In the early centuries, King asserts, there were thriving Christian communities where women served as prophets, teachers, and liturgical leaders. The marginalization of women was a deliberate political decision, not a divine mandate. But here's the most shocking part. Documents from the Council of Constantinople in 553 reveal that Emperor Justinian specifically ordered the destruction of all texts depicting women in roles of spiritual authority. This imperial decree was meticulously executed for decades, with Roman soldiers raiding libraries and monasteries in search of banned manuscripts. The records of the Byzantine historian Evagrius Scholasticus document that in Alexandria alone, more than 2,000 manuscripts containing teachings attributed to female Christian leaders were destroyed. In Antioch, Patriarch John Chrysostom personally oversaw the burning of Gnostic texts, including multiple copies of the Gospel of Mary. However, oral tradition persisted. In Christian communities in Ethiopia, Armenia, and India, stories circulated for centuries about the hidden apostle who had received special revelations from Christ. These traditions, though fragmentary, preserved elements of Mary's teachings that official texts had eliminated. Today, almost 2,000 years later, we can finally see the full magnitude of what was suppressed. It wasn't just another gospel. It wasn't just the story of a remarkable woman. It was an entire dimension of early Christianity that offered a more direct, more personal, and more transformative relationship with the divine. Had you heard about this gospel before this video? Did you know the story of how it was censored and why? Tell me below what you think after learning this historical evidence, because what you're going to discover next about the specific content of the gospel will be even more revealing and transformative. The surviving words carry within them the power that terrorized entire empires. When you open the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you're not simply reading an ancient text. You're accessing intimate conversations between Mary and Jesus that reveal a completely different dimension of his teachings, a dimension so radical that they preferred to bury it for 2 millennia. The text begins with an extraordinary scene. The apostles are gathered after Jesus' ascension, but they are lost, confused, and fearful. They don't know what to do or how to continue. It is then that Mary stands up and begins to speak with an authority that surprises them all. Her first words change the entire atmosphere. Do not cry, nor grieve, nor doubt, for his grace will be with you and protect you. But this is just the beginning. What follows is a revelation that shatters everything you thought you knew about the nature of Christian salvation. Mary begins to recount a private vision she had with Jesus, a conversation that revealed secrets he had not shared with any other disciple. I saw the Lord in a vision, Mary says, and I said to him, Lord, I saw you today in a vision. He answered me, Blessed are you because you did not falter at seeing me. For where the mind is, there is treasure. To us, these seemingly simple words contain a theological bombshell. Jesus is validating direct visionary experience as a legitimate path to divine truth. Do you understand the implication? You don't need intermediaries. You don't need institutions. You don't need others to interpret the divine for you. Where your mind is prepared, there is spiritual treasure. This teaching made unnecessary the entire mediating structure that the institutional church was building. But the revelation goes even deeper. Mary asks Jesus, Lord, how does the one who sees the visions see them? through the soul or through the spirit? Jesus' response reveals a completely different spiritual anthropology. They are seen neither through the soul nor through the spirit, but the mind, which is between the two, is what sees the vision. This teaching about the mind as the meeting point between soul and spirit reflects a philosophical sophistication that rivaled the best schools of thought of the time. Jesus is describing a model of human consciousness where there is a middle ground, a mental faculty that can perceive spiritual realities directly. In Gnostic traditions, this faculty was known as nous, a form of intuitive intelligence that transcends ordinary reasoning. Maria had developed this ability to an exceptional degree, allowing her to access teachings that others could not receive. The Gospel continues with Mary recounting an extraordinary vision of the soul's ascent after death. In this vision, Jesus teaches her about the 7 powers of wrath that the soul must confront on its journey toward final liberation. Each power represents a specific obstacle that keeps the soul trapped in patterns of ignorance and suffering. The first power is darkness, which represents the fundamental ignorance about our divine nature. The second is desire, which binds us to the illusions of the material world. The third is ignorance, which prevents us from recognizing our true spiritual identity. The fourth is the excitement of death, the fear that paralyzes us in the face of the unknown. The fifth power is the kingdom of the flesh, the excessive identification with the physical body. The sixth is the foolish wisdom of the flesh, the belief that material satisfaction can give us spiritual fulfillment. The seventh and most powerful is foolish anger, the violent reaction to anything that challenges our illusions. What's extraordinary about this teaching is its psychological precision. Jesus isn't talking about external powers that attack us, but about internal patterns that we ourselves have created. Liberation comes not from external intervention, but from conscious recognition of how these patterns operate within us. Maria recounts how the enlightened soul responds to each of these powers. When darkness asks, "Where do you come from, manslayer?" or "Where are you going, conqueror of spaces?" the soul replies, "What binds me has been killed, and what encloses me has been vanquished, and my desire has come to an end, and ignorance has died." This answer reveals a profound understanding of the nature of spiritual liberation. It's not about escaping the world, but about transforming our relationship with it. It's not about destroying the ego, but about recognizing its illusory nature. When the soul encounters desire, this power attempts to hold it back, saying, "I did not see you descend, but now I see you ascend. Why do you lie when you belong to me?" The soul replies, "I saw you, but you did not see me or recognize me. I was your garment, and you did not recognize me." This conversation reveals something profound about the nature of temptation and liberation. The awakened soul is no longer deluded by the powers that once controlled it. It can recognize them for what they are, projections of its own unconsciousness that no longer have power over it. The teaching continues with the soul facing ignorance, which protests, "Where are you going? You have been dominated by evil. You have been dominated. Do not judge." But the soul responds with a declaration of absolute freedom. "Why do you judge me when I have not judged? I have been dominated, although I have not dominated. I have not been recognized, but I have recognized that the universe is being destroyed, both earthly and heavenly things." These words contain an extraordinary cosmological revelation. The awakened soul recognizes that the entire material universe is in a constant process of dissolution and renewal. This understanding frees it from attachment to any specific form and allows it to participate in the divine creative process from a perspective of total freedom. But what makes this teaching so revolutionary is its insistence that this liberation is available to any soul willing to undertake the inner journey. It is not a privilege reserved for a select few. It requires no special initiation or institutional authorization. It is the birthright of every human being. Mary concludes her account by describing how the soul finally transcends all powers and reaches what she calls the silence of eternal repose. In this state, the soul recognizes its original identity as a direct emanation of divine light, free from all limitations and consciously united with the source of all that exists. When Mary finishes sharing this vision, the apostles' reaction is revealing. Some are astonished by the depth of the teaching. Others are disturbed by its implications. Peter, representing the institutional mindset, bursts out in protest. Did the Savior speak privately to a woman and not clearly to us? Should we all turn and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? This question from Peter reveals the core of the conflict between two models of spiritual authority. Peter represents the hierarchical model, where authority comes from official appointment and is transmitted through institutional structures. Mary represents the charismatic model, where authority comes from direct experience and is validated by depth of understanding. Andrew joins the protest. Say what you think about what she said. I, for one, do not believe that the Savior said this, for these teachings are certainly strange ideas. Andrew's resistance reveals something crucial. Mary's teachings were so advanced that even the closest apostles found them incomprehensible. But Levi, who represents a more open perspective, defends Mary. Peter, you were always impulsive. Now I see you contending against the woman as if she were an adversary. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. He loved her more than us. These words have echoed through the centuries, generating speculation and controversy. But in the context of the Gnostic gospel, this love is neither romantic nor exclusive. It is the recognition of a special capacity for spiritual understanding. In the Gnostic tradition, Christ's love for Mary represents divine recognition of a soul that has reached an exceptional degree of spiritual preparation. It is the same kind of love that a teacher feels for the disciple who best understands his deepest teachings. The gospel ends with a powerful scene. After Levi's defense, Mary weeps. But her tears are not of sadness, but of compassion for those who cannot grasp the magnitude of what is being offered to them. Then she withdraws in silence, taking with her the teachings that would change the world if they were allowed to flourish. This is the revelation that was silenced for 2,000 years. A teaching that places the power of spiritual transformation directly in your hands, that recognizes you as capable of accessing divine truth without intermediaries, that invites you to embark on the same inner journey that Mary undertook under the direct guidance of Christ. Can you imagine how Christianity would have been different if these teachings had remained at the center of the faith? How would history have changed if millions of Christians had grown up knowing they had direct access to visionary experience, that they didn't need intermediaries to find God? Now you understand why this gospel was so dangerous. It didn't just challenge religious power structures. It offered a completely different alternative, a Christianity of direct experience, of inner authority, of immediate personal transformation, a love that defied the system. This phrase captures the essence of what truly existed between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, according to the Gnostic texts. But before your mind races toward romantic interpretations fueled by popular novels, let me guide you to the actual historical evidence. What you are about to discover is far deeper and more revolutionary than any conventional love story. In the Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text found at Nag Hammadi, a statement is made that has generated speculation for decades. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her frequently on the mouth. The other disciples were offended by this and expressed their disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" Before interpreting this passage through modern lenses, we need to understand the cultural and spiritual context of the time. In Gnostic traditions, the kiss was not a romantic gesture, but a ritual for transmitting spiritual knowledge. It was a symbol of the direct communication of wisdom between master and most advanced disciple. Professor Marvin Meyer, a world authority on Gnostic texts, explains that in the mystery schools of antiquity, the kiss on the mouth represented the literal transfer of pneuma, the spiritual breath that carried esoteric teachings. Jesus wasn't being romantic with Mary. He was publicly acknowledging her exceptional capacity to receive and preserve the deepest teachings. But this leads us to a deeper question. Why did Mary have this special ability? What distinguished her from the other disciples? The Gnostic texts offer a fascinating answer that reveals a whole new dimension of the relationship between Jesus and Mary. In the Gospel of Mary, when Peter questions Mary's authority to teach, Levi responds with a crucial revelation. Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. The Greek word translated know here is gnosis, not intellectual knowledge, but direct experiential spiritual understanding. This means that Jesus recognized in Mary a soul that had reached a level of spiritual development that made her capable of understanding teachings that others could not yet assimilate. This wasn't personal favoritism, it was recognition of spiritual capacity. The texts present Mary as what in esoteric traditions is known as Christ's syzygy, his perfect spiritual complement. In Gnostic cosmology, every divine emanation has a counterpart that completes its cosmic expression. Mary was not simply a disciple, she was the feminine aspect of divine wisdom manifested through Christ. This relationship is described in terms that transcend ordinary human categories. In the Gospel of Philip we read, "Those who are united in the bridal chamber will never be separated again." But the bridal chamber here is not a human marriage ceremony. It is the state of mystical union where two consciousnesses merge into a shared spiritual understanding. Researcher Jean-Yves Leloup, one of the most respected translators of Gnostic texts, explains that the relationship between Jesus and Mary represents the sacred marriage between wisdom, Sophia, and love, agape. In this union, Mary embodies the receptive wisdom that can contain and shape the revelations of divine love manifested through Christ. Consider this remarkable passage from the Gospel of Philip. Mary Magdalene is the one called the companion. She is the mystery of wisdom. Barren wisdom bears no fruit, therefore she is called the salt of the earth. This text is not describing a romantic relationship, it is explaining a cosmic function. Mary represents the capacity of human consciousness to receive, understand, and preserve divine revelation. Her relationship with Jesus is the archetype of the ideal relationship between disciple and teacher, between the human soul and the divine presence. But the texts go even further. In the dialogue of the Savior, another Gnostic gospel, Mary is presented as the woman who knows everything. When the disciples ask questions about the nature of reality, it is Mary who frequently offers the most profound answers. On one occasion, after Mary answers a complex question about the nature of the cosmos, the text says, Jesus praised her because she had become completely spiritual. This dynamic reveals something revolutionary about how Jesus viewed human spiritual potential. For him, the capacity for spiritual understanding was not dependent on gender, social position, or official designation. It depended on the preparation of the soul and the openness of consciousness. In the Gospel of Thomas, we find a statement that has confused many scholars. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary go away from us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, like you males. For every woman who becomes male will enter the kingdom of heaven." This passage, taken literally, seems deeply misogynistic. But in the Gnostic context, male and female do not refer to physical genders, but to cosmic principles. Male represents the active, penetrating consciousness that seeks truth. Female represents the receptive, nurturing consciousness that preserves wisdom. Jesus is saying that Mary has already developed both aspects of spiritual awareness. She can actively seek truth like the male disciples, but she can also receive and preserve it in ways they have not yet learned. This interpretation is confirmed in other passages where Mary demonstrates both her capacity for spiritual inquiry and her ability to synthesize and preserve. In the Gospel of Mary, she not only receives a private vision of Christ, she is also able to articulate it coherently and teach it to others. Mary's role as apostle to the apostles takes on new meaning in this context. She wasn't just the first to see the risen Christ, she was the first to fully understand what that resurrection meant spiritually. She was the first to integrate the experience of spiritual death and rebirth that all the disciples would have to go through. Gnostic texts suggest that Jesus saw in Mary the perfect example of what every human soul could become. His relationship with her was, in a sense, his relationship with humanity's highest potential. Through Mary, Jesus was demonstrating that spiritual enlightenment was not the privilege of a select few, but the inherent possibility of every consciousness willing to awaken. This perspective completely transforms our understanding of Christ's message. He did not come merely to die for the sins of humanity. He came to awaken the divine potential that already existed within every soul. Mary was the first to fully realize this potential, becoming the model of what Jesus called the kingdom of heaven. The love between Jesus and Mary was the love between the divine source and the human consciousness, perfectly prepared to receive it. It was the love between the master who sees hidden potential and the disciple who has the courage to realize it. It was the love that transforms not only the individuals involved, but offers a new model of spiritual relationship for all humanity. That's why this love challenged the system, not because it was romantic or scandalous, but because it demonstrated that genuine spiritual authority comes not from external institutions, but from inner transformation. Mary didn't need to be ordained by men. She had been consecrated by direct experience of the divine. Her relationship with Jesus set a dangerous precedent, that any soul, regardless of gender or social standing, could directly access the divine presence and become an authorized channel of spiritual teaching. This rendered unnecessary all the hierarchies that church leaders were constructing. The Gnostic Gospels feature numerous scenes where Mary demonstrates this innate spiritual authority. In theological conversations, she frequently grasps concepts that the other disciples find difficult. When controversy arises, it is her perspective that frequently offers the most profound synthesis. This dynamic created an impossible situation for those who wanted to establish an exclusively male hierarchy. If Mary had direct access to Christ's teachings, if she could interpret his message with authority, then women could not be systematically excluded from spiritual leadership. Now you understand why this relationship had to be distorted. The story of human love was far less threatening than the truth of a spiritual union that opened the doors to enlightenment for all. The woman who frightened power. This is not a rhetorical exaggeration. It is the most accurate description of why Mary Magdalene had to be systematically eliminated from Christian history. It wasn't just her gender that threatened the emerging structures of institutional Christianity. It was what her gender represented in the context of her spiritual authority, living proof that divine power does not recognize human hierarchies. To understand the magnitude of this suppression, we need to examine not only what was removed, but how it was replaced. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle to the apostles to repentant prostitute was not an accidental historical error. It was a systematic propaganda operation that took centuries to complete, and that reveals the deepest anxieties of the early architects of institutional Christianity. Historian Karen Armstrong has documented how early Christian communities included a significant number of women leaders. Priscilla taught theology to Apollos. Phoebe was a deaconess in Centuria. Junia was recognized as an apostle by Paul. Mary Magdalene was venerated as the first witness of the resurrection and a transmitter of special teachings. But as Christianity began to interact with the power structures of the Roman Empire, these female leaders became a problem. Rome was a deeply patriarchal society where women held no public authority. If Christianity was to be respected and eventually adopted by the Roman elites, it needed to conform to cultural expectations about gender roles. The process of marginalization began in the 2nd century with writers like Tertullian, who declared, "It is not lawful for a woman to speak in church, nor to teach, nor to baptize, nor to offer." But Tertullian was reacting against something that already existed: Christian communities where women actually spoke, taught, baptized, and officiated. The case of Mary Magdalene was particularly problematic because her authority was not based on human appointment, but on direct divine experience. The canonical Gospels themselves attest that she was the first to see the risen Christ, the first to receive the mandate to proclaim the resurrection, and the first to fulfill the fundamental apostolic function. But the Gnostic texts revealed something even more disturbing, that Mary had not only witnessed the resurrection, but had also received private teachings that placed her in a position of interpretive authority over Christ's message. This created a crisis of legitimacy for the male leaders who were establishing their own lines of apostolic authority. The strategy of suppression was multifaceted and brilliant in its simplicity. First, texts that featured Mary in leadership roles were declared heretical and excluded from the canon. Second, her image was gradually transformed through deliberate confusion with other biblical women. Third, a new narrative was created that presented her as a symbol of redeemed sin. Pope Gregory the Great completed this transformation in 591 when he officially declared that Mary Magdalene was the same person as the sinful woman mentioned in Luke 7 and Mary of Bethany. There was no biblical evidence for this identification. It was a purely political decision designed to eliminate any vestige of Mary's original authority. But the suppression of Mary Magdalene was only part of a broader pattern of systematic exclusion of women from Christian leadership. Researcher Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza has shown how this process involved the active rewriting of early Christian history to make the marginalization of women seem natural and inevitable. Consider this chilling fact. In the Christian catacombs of Rome, there are multiple inscriptions and frescoes depicting women officiating rituals, teaching, and leading communities. This archaeological evidence directly contradicts the official narrative that women never held leadership roles in early Christianity. Even more revealing is the pattern of evidence destruction. Manuscripts mentioning women leaders were systematically lost or destroyed. Oral traditions preserving their stories were declared legends with no historical value. Sacred sites associated with them were rededicated to male saints. In the specific case of Mary Magdalene, the evidence of this deliberate suppression is overwhelming. Church fathers writing in the early centuries occasionally make reference to Gospels of Mary circulating in Christian communities. These texts were systematically confiscated and destroyed. Jerome, writing in the 4th century, mentions having seen copies of teachings attributed to Mary Magdalene, but dismisses them as Gnostic fantasies. Epiphanius of Salamis describes a Christian sect called the Montanists, who venerated Mary Magdalene as the Sophia of Christ and had female prophets who claimed to channel her teachings. These references allow us to reconstruct the popularity of Mary Magdalene in early Christian communities and the resistance this popularity encountered among male church leaders. We are not talking about marginal traditions. We are talking about mainstream Christian movements that were deliberately suppressed. The process of suppression accelerated dramatically when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine. Imperial power could now be used to impose doctrinal uniformity. Imperial edicts not only declared certain texts heretical, they ordered their destruction under penalty of death. The historian Eusebius's records document that during the 4th century, systematic purges of Christian libraries were carried out to eliminate texts that did not conform to Nicene orthodoxy. Thousands of manuscripts were publicly burned. Scribes who refused to hand over heretical copies were executed. Mary Magdalene became a victim of this purge, not only because she was a woman, but because she represented a form of Christian authority that could not be controlled by male institutions. Her authority came directly from Christ, not from episcopal appointment. Her teaching was based on mystical experience, not doctrinal interpretation. This made her doubly dangerous. She didn't just challenge gender expectations, she challenged the entire institutional church model that Christian leaders were building. If Mary could have direct spiritual authority, then anyone could. If women could interpret Christ's teachings, then bishops weren't necessary. Professor Anne Graham Brock has analyzed this pattern in multiple early Christian texts. Her research shows that the more spiritual authority ascribed to Mary Magdalene in a text, the more likely it was to be declared heretical and suppressed. This correlation reveals that the suppression of Mary Magdalene was motivated not by genuine theological concerns, but by anxiety over institutional control. Church leaders understood that if the model of spiritual authority represented by Mary was allowed to flourish, their project of building a centralized hierarchical church would collapse. The result was one of the most successful censorship operations in human history. For over 1,000 years, entire generations of Christians grew up unaware that there had ever been an apostle to the apostles, unaware that the earliest Christian communities had had female leaders. This suppression not only changed the history of Christianity, it changed the history of Western civilization. How would our culture have been different if women had held spiritual authority in the Christian tradition? How would Christian theology have evolved if it had included female perspectives from the beginning? Its history is not just the past. It's a window into future possibilities that were cut short 2,000 years ago, but can now be recovered. What if this truth can heal your faith? This is not a rhetorical question. It is the real experience of thousands of people who have rediscovered the authentic story of Mary Magdalene and found in it the key to reconciling their spiritual lives with their intellectual search for truth. In a world where millions are abandoning Christianity because they feel it is irrelevant or repressive, the revelation about Mary Magdalene offers something extraordinary. a path back to a deeper, more authentic, and more transformative faith. We live in a time of unprecedented spiritual awakening. People are no longer satisfied with prefabricated answers to profound existential questions. They seek direct experience of the sacred, not just beliefs about it. They seek a spirituality that honors both their intellect and their heart, both their need for transcendence and their demand for authenticity. The rediscovery of Mary Magdalene comes at the perfect moment in history to meet exactly these needs. Her story offers a model of Christian spirituality that is simultaneously deeply mystical and rigorously intellectual. A faith that is based on direct inner experience, but can also withstand the harshest academic scrutiny. In recent decades, we have seen the emergence of what sociologists call post-institutional Christianity. These are communities of people who love Christ and his teachings, but can no longer find a spiritual home in traditional religious structures. They feel that conventional churches have lost their connection with the original transformative power of the Christian message. For these people, Mary Magdalene is becoming a powerful symbol of what Christianity can be when freed from institutional constraints. She represents a faith that requires no intermediaries between the soul and the divine, a spirituality that celebrates direct mystical experience, a path that honors both the masculine and feminine as essential aspects of the divine image. Consider how the story of Mary Magdalene responds to the deepest spiritual crises of our time. In a culture that has systematically marginalized female voices, she emerges as a model of feminine spiritual authority that derives its power not from patriarchal institutions, but from a direct connection to the sacred. In an age where people desperately seek authentic experiences of transcendence, Mary's Gnostic teachings offer specific techniques for developing spiritual perception. Her gospel doesn't just speak of enlightenment, it provides a detailed map of the inner journey toward spiritual fulfillment. In a world fragmented by religious divisions, her message transcends sectarian categories. The teachings she preserved focus on the universal experience of the human soul awakening to its divine nature. It is a spirituality that can speak to both Christians and seekers from other traditions. But Mary Magdalene's relevance goes beyond personal spirituality. Her story has profound implications for how we understand contemporary social issues such as gender equality, institutional authority, and the individual right to direct religious experience. In current discussions about the role of women in religious leadership, Mary Magdalene provides a powerful historical precedent. It's not just that women can be spiritual leaders. At the very beginning of Christianity, women were recognized as the bearers of the highest spiritual authority. This historical precedent is being used by feminist theologians, such as Rosemary Radford Ruther, to argue that the exclusion of women from religious leadership is unjustified in the earliest Christian traditions. They are demonstrating that the marginalization of women was a later distortion, not an original feature of Christ's message. In the field of transpersonal psychology, the visionary experiences described in the Gospel of Mary are being studied as examples of expanded states of consciousness. Researchers such as Stanislav Grof have noted that Mary's descriptions of the ascent of the soul correspond remarkably with experiences reported in contemporary mystical states. This convergence between ancient texts and modern research on consciousness is creating a new field of study that we might call Gnostic neurotheology. Scientists are discovering that spiritual practices described in texts like the Gospel of Mary produce measurable changes in brain structure and function. Dr. Andrew Newberg, a pioneer in neurotheology, has documented how contemplative practices similar to those taught by Mary Magdalene activate brain regions associated with states of unity and transcendence. This provides scientific validation for spiritual experiences that for centuries were dismissed as imagination or self-deception. For younger generations, especially millennials and Generation Z who have grown up with access to global information and multiple perspectives, the story of Mary Magdalene resonates deeply. It represents a spirituality that doesn't ask them to abandon their critical thinking, but rather to integrate it with their spiritual quest. These young people are creating new forms of spiritual community that honor both ancient tradition and contemporary understanding. They are forming study circles that explore Gnostic texts, meditation groups that practice the techniques described in the Gospel of Mary, and communities that celebrate both the masculine and feminine aspects of the divine. In the context of the current mental health crisis, Mary Magdalene's teachings on transforming the powers of anger offer practical tools for psychological healing. Her description of the soul learning to transcend destructive patterns provides a spiritual framework for what modern psychology calls emotional regulation. But perhaps Mary Magdalene's most profound relevance for our time is how her story challenges the false dichotomy between faith and reason that has plagued Western culture for centuries. She represents a form of knowledge that is simultaneously rational and intuitive, empirical and mystical, personal and universal. In an age where many people feel they must choose between being intellectually honest or spiritually satisfied, Mary Magdalene offers a third path. Her example suggests that the rigorous search for truth and the profound experience of the sacred are not only compatible but mutually enriching. What country are you watching this video from? Leave your flag below and tell me how this story resonates with you. Because what you're experiencing isn't just intellectual curiosity. It's the recognition of something your soul already knew, but that your mind can finally accept. This is the ultimate relevance of Mary Magdalene for our time. She is not just a fascinating historical figure. She is a living guide to a spirituality that can heal the inner divisions that have fragmented so many modern souls in search of authentic meaning. The kingdom is within you. These words of Jesus, recorded in the Gospel of Thomas, encapsulate the central message that Mary Magdalene preserved and passed on during 2,000 years of enforced silence. They are not just pretty words to decorate a wall or a verse to memorize. They are a revolutionary statement about the nature of your own spiritual identity that has the power to completely transform how you experience life. But before these words can change your life, you need to understand what they really mean. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom, he wasn't describing a geographical location you go to after you die if you meet certain conditions. He was revealing a dimension of reality that exists right now, at this moment, within your own consciousness, waiting to be recognized and activated. Mary Magdalene understood this in a way that even the closest apostles could not initially grasp. In her private visions with Christ, she directly accessed this inner reality and learned how to consciously navigate through the different levels of spiritual perception that constitute the true nature of the kingdom. This isn't vague mysticism or magical thinking. It's a precise spiritual science that recognizes that human consciousness is far more vast and powerful than modern culture has taught us to believe. Your mind isn't just the product of chemical processes in your brain. It's an aspect of the divine mind itself, capable of perceiving dimensions of reality that transcend the limitations of the material world. The spiritual awakening that Mary Magdalene experienced and taught doesn't require you to surrender your intellect or accept irrational beliefs. On the contrary, it requires you to use your intellect more deeply and completely than you have ever done before. It requires you to ask yourself questions that go to the very heart of your existence. Who are you really? What is your life's purpose? These are the questions Mary explored in her dialogues with Christ, and the answers she received are available to you now. Not because you are special or chosen in some exclusive sense, but because you are human. Because you possess the same innate capacity for direct spiritual perception that she developed under Jesus' guidance. In the Gospel of Mary, when Christ teaches her about the 7 powers the soul must transcend, he's not talking about mystical external forces. He's describing specific psychological patterns that keep human consciousness trapped in limited levels of perception. The darkness of ignorance about your true nature, the desire that binds you to temporary satisfactions, the anger that arises when reality doesn't conform to your expectations. These patterns are not enemies to be violently combated. They are aspects of your own psyche that you need to understand, accept, and ultimately transcend through the conscious recognition of who you truly are, an individualized expression of divine consciousness itself, temporarily incarnated in human form to experience and express God's creative love in the material world. This recognition isn't just a nice idea or a comforting belief. It's a direct insight that fundamentally transforms your relationship with everything you experience. When you know who you truly are, fear loses its power over you. When you recognize your innate divine nature, the need to seek external validation dissolves. When you experience your direct connection to the source of all that exists, the sense of separation and loneliness naturally fades. But this awakening isn't a one-time event that occurs and then remains stable forever. It's a continuous process of deepening and expanding consciousness that unfolds throughout your entire life. Each day offers new opportunities to more fully recognize your true identity. Each challenge becomes an invitation to apply your spiritual understanding to specific circumstances. Mary Magdalene understood that this process of awakening cannot be forced or artificially accelerated. It requires patience, dedication, and above all, profound humility before the mystery of existence. It requires the willingness to question not only the beliefs you have inherited from others, but also the conclusions you have reached on your own. It requires the courage to remain open to the possibility that everything you thought you knew about yourself, about God, and about the nature of reality may be just the beginning of a much vaster and more extraordinary understanding. The call Mary Magdalene makes to you throughout the centuries is not to adopt a new religion or abandon your current one. It is to awaken to the reality of what you already are, what you have always been, a conscious manifestation of the infinite love that is the essence of all existence. This awakening is not just for your personal benefit. When you recognize your true nature, you automatically become a channel through which that same possibility of awakening can reach others. You become a beacon of hope for all souls seeking a way to experience the sacred that honors both their need for truth and their hunger for transformation. Mary Magdalene is calling you now, at this moment, to join her in the secret lineage of those who have awakened to the kingdom within. Are you ready to answer this call that can transform your life forever? They silenced her. You can make her heard again. For 2,000 years, the power of Mary Magdalene's message has lain dormant, waiting for the exact moment in history when souls would be ready to receive it without distorting it, to understand it without reducing it, to live it without limiting it. That moment is now. That moment is you. What you have discovered in these minutes is not just fascinating historical information. It is the key that opens the door to an experience of Christianity that is simultaneously older and more modern than anything you have ever known before. Older because it goes back to the original teachings of Christ, preserved by his most enlightened disciple. More modern because it perfectly responds to the spiritual thirst of the contemporary soul. Mary Magdalene was not silenced by accident. She was silenced because her message held the power to free millions of souls from spiritual dependence on external institutions. Her gospel revealed that every human being has direct access to the experience of the divine, that every conscience can awaken to its own sacred nature, that every soul can become a channel of Christ's transforming love. This message was too dangerous for those who built empires based on the control of spiritual authority. But now, in an age where information cannot be censored so easily, where hidden truths can travel instantly around the world, where millions of people seek spiritual authenticity over religious conformity, his message can finally fulfill its original purpose. But this will only happen if you choose to be part of this restoration, if you choose to become a modern guardian of this ancient wisdom, if you have the courage to explore more deeply what it means to live from the kingdom within you. The story of Mary Magdalene that you learned today is just the beginning. There is a whole tradition of Christian mystical teachings that has survived in texts, in contemplative practices, in lines of secret transmission that have been preserved for centuries, awaiting this moment of global revelation. Do you want to be part of this recovery? Are you ready to explore more deeply what it means to be a true disciple of Christ in the 21st century? Do you have the curiosity and courage to discover what else has been hidden from the authentic Christian tradition? Subscribe now and continue with the next revelation that will appear on your screen. Don't stop here, because what you've seen today is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole dimension of early Christianity waiting to be rediscovered. Lost gospels that reveal even more extraordinary teachings, spiritual practices that early Christians used to directly access states of enlightened consciousness. Mary Magdalene has waited 2,000 years for the perfect moment in history when her message could be heard without being distorted. That moment is now. That person is you. Don't let this revelation get lost in the noise of everyday life. Don't let the inertia of routine make you forget the depth of what you have experienced in these minutes. Your soul has recognized something true here. Your spirit has felt the resonance of a wisdom that can transform not only your intellectual understanding, but your lived experience of what it means to be alive. Subscribe now. Continue this journey. Allow Mary Magdalene to finally fulfill her mission of awakening souls ready for the full truth about Christ's message. The kingdom is within you. It's time to explore it. It's time to live it. It's time to share it with a world desperately hungry for a spirituality that is both deeply transformative and completely authentic. The next revelation is waiting for you. Don't miss it. Thank you for watching this video. Until the end, we will see you in the next video.